I was born in London. My father had gone there as a student, stayed on to work for a couple of Indian publications as their representative, selling space to English companies operating in India. So advertising was the field he had got into. And when I was born, he was a young London manager of the Statesman newspaper at a time when all the managers in India were Englishmen. So he never really saw himself as a migrant. He'd gone first, his elder brother had been working in England, so brought him along with his younger brothers, to study, improve their prospects in life. But he was essentially planning to go back all along. And when the moment an Englishman retired in Bombay, the Bombay manager of the Statesman, he said to go back. I was all of two and a half, went back to Bombay, and essentially grew up there. There was one abortive stint at boarding school, which didn't quite suit me. But I was a precocious child, so I got into the third standard, as it then was, through the entrance exams when I was only 5 years old. So the problem was I was turning 6 when all the others were turning 8. I had the other problem that when we came back to England, I developed rather severe bronchial asthma. And between my illness and the sort of emotional gap between me and the older children, I was spending a lot of time in the infirmary at the school, the boarding school, Montfort. And at the same time, I was doing well in study. That was the one thing I was always good at. So I aced all the exams, but I ended up with this problem. And even though I missed some exams because of being essentially in bed, I still came third in class that year, and technically should have been eligible for the 4th standard. The school wrote to my parents saying this boy should be with his parents. He's too young to deal with life on his own. So I went back, and when I went back, the school in Bombay campaign said, no way we can take a 6-year-old into the 4th standard. I don't care what his marks are. He'll have to do 3rd again. So I still have the stigma of having had to repeat a year, despite having done very well in the previous year. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I had a great time in some ways at Campion School, Bombay, because they were very strong in extracurriculars. I would argue probably they were not as strong as my subsequent school became in academics, but in extracurriculars, outstanding. My writing skills developed writing for the school magazine and so on. My acting, there was a very strong theatre tradition. Pearl Padamsi came and started offering theatre classes after school. And I discovered a great taste and talent for that. And there was elocution. There was debating, but I was too young for debating. You only debated in high school from class 9 onwards. But the youngsters who showed any promise were sent off to these debates to interject. That's a very good tradition in inter-school debates. You can raise your hand at the end of the debate and ask questions to the other side. So I became quite a notorious interjector, giving a rough time to the principal other schools. Cathedral and Campion was the big rivalry. So all this happened up to class 8. At the end of class 8, in fact January of class 9, the school year beginning in January, my father got transferred or promoted to Calcutta to head the entire advertising for the entire group. The Statesman is headquartered in Calcutta. They had an edition in Delhi. They had offices in Chennai, in Madras, in Bombay, Bangalore, and so on. And he was in charge of the whole thing. So it was a big promotion for him, obviously quite a major change for me, but again a happy change, because those 3 years of high school at St. Xavier's, Calcutta, in many ways, were a useful corrective to the shallowness of materialism that was around me in the culture at that time in Bombay, because while certainly we were not as adept at theatre, and I kept winning all the speeches and debates because nobody had the kind of, I suppose, background in that I'd already had. Nonetheless, what the school taught was a terrific sense of values, social service, having a conscience, and human relations. Calcutta was already going through major ferment. This is 1969 January. You had the UF government coming, falling, communists, right? Every wall had slogans on it. China's chairman is our chairman, and all this sort of stuff. A Naxalite movement had started. The most famous theatre in Calcutta was folk street theatre. People performing plays on the street, usually plays with urgent social messaging and so on. So it was an amazing place to mature, to develop political consciousness. Obviously, I became, in reaction to what I saw of the Naxalite excesses, I became rather right of center in terms of my personal political philosophy, but it was still fascinating to be part of all that, relate to all that. The intellectual atmosphere was heady. Wherever you went, people were talking ideas, talking politics.
So which standard you were in? I mean,
so 9, 10, 11. In those days, school was finishing at 11. So 9, 10, 11 was Calcutta. So I was born in 56. I passed out of class 11 at the end of 71. And so 9, 10, 11 was a very, very crucial periods for Calcutta. But 71 also caused me some anxiety for another reason, which is the university, which was at one point very famous. And my favorite subject was history. And I wanted to study at Presidency College. But Calcutta University by 70, 71, the Vice Chancellor of Jalapur University was murdered. Calcutta University exams were disrupted by Naxalites, student protests, demonstrations, communist student movements fighting Congress student movements. You basically ended up being convinced that either the exams would not take place or they would not take place on time. And if they did, the results you got, you don't know when you'll get them and whether they'd really be your own results. It was that bad. So suddenly this famous university had declined precipitously at that time because of all this violence. And so I decided to go to St. Stephen's College in Delhi. So that's broadly the early phase of my life. Any important things there? I think the asthma was one major thing. It was perhaps amongst the most character-forming experiences because I was struggling for breath a lot of the time. Every time I had an asthma attack. These are the days before inhalers had been invented. Preventive medication didn't exist. People didn't fully understand why asthma was being caused. So for example, a major surgeon had my tonsils removed. And in fact, asthma has nothing to do with your tonsils. But in those days, they were trying to figure out why is one person creating this, the bronchoids getting stuck and not able to breathe, and why are others differently. So in my case, it became a tough period. Remember, I was a small child. I mean, from 2.5 onwards, I was suffering. When you are not able to breathe, all the things you enjoy doing as a child, like going out and playing, become that much more difficult. Some days you can play, other days you're too ill to play because you're not able to breathe properly. There's no TV in my childhood, no Nintendo, no computers, no mobile phones, no handheld games, nothing. All there was books. So my illness also made me a reader, and made me a serious reader that I devoured, because I was the oldest child out of 3, and my sisters are very small. One is 4 years younger than me, the others were 6 years younger than me. So, and I had no elder brothers or sisters whose books I could borrow. Right. So, and I used to read very fast. I started reading soon after 2, and often if my parents took me to a library, I would finish the book in the car on the way home. And that became a handicap, because then what would I read? So I would start reading my parents' books. I read way above my age level from a very young age, because I had no other choice. It was either that or I played book cricket, which was great fun. You open a fat book and look at the page numbers and you make up imaginary scores for your players and so on, which I loved, and I was a great book cricket addict. But apart from those 2 activities, what could you do? So that made a writer out of me. Around age 6, I started writing my first story, very much inspired by the kind of Western books I was reading, Enid Blyton, Biggles, that sort of thing. And when I had just turned, when I was a little over 10, my father sent off 1 or 2 of my stories to publications. And the Free Press Journal had a Sunday paper in Bombay called the Bharat Jyoti. And they used to carry a short story every Sunday, and they carried 1 of my stories. So when I was 10 years old, I first saw my name in print. And you can imagine what an addiction that becomes. The thrill of seeing your name in print, it's like the first kiss or the first bite of chocolate, and you want to do it again. And that's really what happened with my writing, is that the bug hit me very early. And then the discipline came out, come back from school, finish my homework, and then write either articles or stories or whatever. A lot of it is probably quite forgettable, and it'd be difficult now to find them all, but still, the main thing it taught me was how to write for an audience, because I was writing for Indian newspapers and magazines. And that meant that my readers are people I was meeting around me. My parents' friends would comment on things I had published.
What was that the first piece that you had written on?
So the very first thing I wrote was a story which actually was inspired by an American Civil War story, where the country was divided into 2. And I wrote 2 versions of that story. I first wrote it as an American story, which is very imitative and derivative. I'm sorry, that's what happened. It was about a father who was a Union general and a son who was a Confederate soldier, and the father kills the son. So God knows what Freudian complexes there were. But in any case, that was what Free Press Journal published. I subsequently rewrote the same idea as a story about when the Tamil language riots broke out. And I wrote the story about an IPS officer who is taking action against these protesters and his own son is the victim. So the same idea, but much more relevant locally. Similarly, my first collection of, my first serialized attempt at a novel, 6 installments in the Junior Statesman, followed just before my 11th birthday. And it was completely imitative of Biggles, except that I had an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot called Reginald Bellows, who's Bellows, Biggles. You can see the kid's inspiration fighting in World War II along with his pal George Singh, this kind of thing. So it was obviously very much imitative, derivative, but that's how you learn to write. And I've always believed no one can teach you to write. You teach yourself by reading extensively, seeing what works in other people's styles, seeing what naturally comes to it. In very ways, writing is as natural an activity as talking. And just as the way you talk is unique to you, the way you write is also unique to you. It really can't be learned. Or if it is, it'll be boring. So be yourself and write, and that's what I did. So that's one major thing from my childhood, was how I became a writer. People keep asking about the vocabulary and so on.
Yeah.
I say I've hardly ever looked up a dictionary in my life, because what I did was I read so extensively that if you come across the same word 3 times in 3 different books in 3 different contexts, then meaning, the nuance becomes very apparent to you. And usually the first time you read it, 99 times out of 100 the meaning is apparent from the sentence. Which is why nowadays, even when foreign words are used in books, they don't bother with glossaries. But let's say the person really wants to know the word, he can look it up, but he doesn't need to have a glossary, because this is a novel. Novels don't have glossaries. It's just a word that the meaning of which is apparent from the sentence. That's the argument that now most writers and publishers have come to, even though I started out on the other side of that argument. I can see the merit of it now. Anyway, so that's the first thing is about words and reading and writing. The second thing is about my sort of academic choices in life. I was inconveniently good at taking exams. I just knew how to study for an exam. But taking exams is an art which actually doesn't really mean that you are any intellectual or supremely intelligent, anything like that. It just knows that you know how to quickly read, remember what you've read, reread it in time for the exam, write in the exam, and probably forget it the next day. So I kept coming first in class and all that stuff, and then in class 9, at the end of class 8, we had to stream.
In fact, you were in Bombay?
So yeah, class 3 to 8 was Campion School, and 9, 10, 11 was St. Xavier's Calcutta. So end of class 8 I had to stream, and I opted for humanities. After you do a test and all that, I chose humanities. My teachers and principal were so upset, they called my parents to the school. And they said, this is our best science student. He's come first in science every single year since he's been in the school. Why does he want to do humanities? And my father and mother, being good Malayali middle class parents, had hoped that I would be a doctor or an engineer or something. So they turned to me and said, what's the matter with you? And I said, the fact is I can't stand the subject. So they said, but you come first in it throughout. I said, that's it, I know how to study for exams. You ask me the next day, I'll have forgotten what I wrote. But you ask me today about history or literature. And I will tell you more than has ever been taught to me in the class, because I read for myself, because I was so interested in these subjects. In fact, just a few years ago, an uncle of mine found a notebook of mine, in which I had written essays for myself. These are not essays corrected by the teacher, on subjects of Indian history that were more than were being taught in the class, because I was so interested in Indian history, particularly modern Indian history. My sort of dislike of British colonialism goes back to that class 10, 14 years old, because I've got all these essays about the Black Hole of Calcutta and everything else. Anyway, so my father, very unusual for his generation, because now 2 generations later, people my children's age are telling their kids, you will study what we tell you to study. But my father had the vision and the humanity and the breadth of it to say, all right, you do what you will enjoy, because you're the one who has to go and study in the future. I'm not going to mess up your life. Then again, I came first, I got 5 points, as it was called in those days, which is the highest mark you can get in the country. And I got the gold medal from West Bengal State and everything else, and my parents said, look, at least if you've stuck yourself with humanities, go into economics, you can do an MBA afterwards and make lots of money. And I said, but economics doesn't interest me either, I want to study history. And that, again, my father's decency and vision, I'll always be grateful for the fact that he was broad-minded enough. And again, he said, all right, do what you want. And again, I did the same thing. I topped the university. I went to St. Stephen's College, I came first every year and I came top the university. At that point, a record. But in those days, 65% was a record because marking was much tougher.
Right.
And so,
What are your days at Stephens?
72 to 5.
No, and I mean,
I'll come back to that. So just to finish on the academics, and I'll come back.
First,
And then again, I'd come first. My parents said, for God's sake, at least take the IIM entrance exams. So I did, and the only two IIMs in India, one was Calcutta, one was Ahmedabad. I came first in one and second in the other, in the list after the interviews. So the result was that I could choose either. But meanwhile, I had sent up applications to American universities to study international relations, which is the one subject that was not being taught much in India, except at JNU in a very, I'm afraid, motivated sort of pro-Soviet way, which didn't interest me. And I got admission. In fact, my credentials academically were so good that one university, not understanding my handwriting, it was Cornell, gave me a scholarship to study industrial relations because they couldn't understand I'd written international relations. I had the GRE marks and I'd aced the English as a foreign language exam and so on. And all that remained was the academic credentials and recommendations, which my teachers were very generous with. In fact, I still remember Mohammed Amin, who was head of the Department of History, wrote, "This is the best student I've ever taught in 25 years
from
as a
JNU.
teacher." No, this is St. Stephen's College, Delhi. He
Since
was the head of the Department of History at St. Stephen's College.
Mm.
So I got admission. And the place that I had not heard of earlier, but which one of my seniors who had failed to get in had recommended I apply to, was the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which was run and administered jointly by Harvard and Tufts, but was on the Tufts University campus. Our degrees have both universities on it. We can take courses in either university, but the place on the campus. And I went there and had, again, academics was something that I did thrive on. So I did an MA in 1 year and MA LD, a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy, which is like an MPhil here and then it required a thesis and so on. Did that in 2, and I structured my courses in such a way that I became eligible to write the PhD. Now there's an amusing story there because one of the professors said, because there was a device in those days that they've abolished since then because of me, a device called the academic petition, where you can ask for exceptions to rules. And the committee of very senior professors will decide whether your record warrants it. I had won the Best Student Award at Fletcher and so on. So I applied for an academic petition under which I would take the oral exams for the MALD in such a way that they were also equivalent to the oral exams to qualify to write the PhD, which are normally 2 separate exams separated by 6 months to a year. So one of my professors actually said to me, "Listen, I don't know why you're doing this, but I'm going to fail you." I said, "Why? You've not heard me answer my questions? You've given me an A in all my papers for you. Why would you say that?" He said, "Because nobody can pass a PhD oral without studying 6 months just for it." So with my heart sinking, I said, "I'm going to take a chance." Because then I was also terrified of running out of scholarship money. As it is, I had spent 1 year living on 1 meal a day because my parents couldn't afford to. In any case, India had no foreign exchange. I had gone from India with $8 in my pocket, and my scholarship was exactly calibrated to tuition, room and board. Once I paid tuition and room, I had $1,000, I still remember, for eating. And the meal plan of eating 3 meals a day would have been $1,000. So I went on to 1 meal a day. Occasionally had a second meal when I could afford it. I was skip good. That's how I could buy stamps to write letters home. It was how, in fact, I gave up shaving so I could save money on buying blades. It was that kind of thing. It was an extraordinary experience. And all this is part of growing up. And I have no regrets about any of it. Just telling you the stories because these are what I did. And the second meal was usually an indulgence. I would eat a pizza or a submarine sandwich or something. But because I wasn't eating very much else, I stayed fairly slim and fit.
Is it also because of a vegetarian?
Yeah, being a vegetarian did not help in America because even the so-called hostel food was, for the vegetarians, it was the boiled potatoes, peas and carrots that were available on the side of a meat dish. So it wasn't worth it in any case to be on the meal plan because you're paying for a meat dish, in effect, if you buy the meal plan. And you're getting all this junk, salads and this. And I had grown up without any taste for salads, which now I've since developed. But in those days, I thought, hey, leaves, who's going to eat leaves for a meal? And I was missing my Indian food and spicy food and so on. In fact, my second year at Fletcher, I moved into rented accommodation with 2 friends. And we had rented a house together. But the problem was, I'd never learned to cook. Like any typical Indian son, the only time I would go into the kitchen was to ask when food would be ready. So it became, I literally, my father was sending me, but they had something called extempore speech, which we didn't have in Bombay, at least not in Cambridge. And extempore speech was fabulously interesting. You got a topic, you were locked up in a room, you were given a topic, often just drawn out of a hat or a bowl, and then in 5 minutes you had to go and speak extempore without any preparation on the topic suggested by that thing, and judges would judge you for relevance. And of course, some people eventually gamed the system. They sort of mugged up sort of all-purpose speeches and just adjusted them to the topic slightly. I didn't know that. I just genuinely sort of did what I did, and it went well. In fact, when I was in my first term at St. Xavier's, I won the extempore speech contest at the high school. That's how I suddenly got noticed there. And a few months later, they have an election for something called the Good Conduct Medal. It's the only time when students actually voted, because everything else is appointed by the Jesuit fathers. But the students vote for one student in the high school who should be awarded for his all-round contributions to school and his thing. And I was very proud that in my class 9, I won the Good Conduct Medal for the school, which normally had always been won by class 11 kids. So you can understand why my memories of St. Xavier's tend to be great. And the other thing was that the father, who was the principal, on 2 successive years, asked me to draft his speech for the school equivalent of a convocation. I've forgotten what it was called. The end of the year when prizes are given and so on, the principal speaks to the parents and children about the past year. So twice I wrote it. And I still remember the first time was in class 10. I took the text I had given him to see how much of it he retained. And literally 90% of what he said was what I had written. And I felt terribly good, because I felt, here I am as a 14-year-old child, and I'm writing a speech for a God-knows man in his 50s, who's had plenty of experience and delivered many versions of these speeches before. And that gave me a lot of confidence. I mean, being published, doing things like that, gave me a lot of confidence. Another interesting experience was when I was in school. From the very beginning, they made me one of the editors of the school magazine, and I became the senior editor by my class 10. And that I was just turning 14. And I went through the spasm of discovering rationality and atheism and so on. So I wrote an essay on why God does not exist in a Jesuit school at St. Xavier's, Calcutta. Now, of course, there is always a senior father who vets everything that goes into print. They were smart enough for that. So he did not allow it to be published. But he must have talked about it to one or two of the other fathers. Because in our moral science class, which is the class that non-Christians went to, the Catholics did catechism, and non-Catholics came to moral science. So in the moral science class, there was a very brilliant young priest, brand new priest in his early or mid-20s, a man called Cyril Debrulé, who, in reaction to my argument, delivered one of the most brilliant, clever, well-argued, cogent lectures, which went above the heads of most of the rest of the class, but I knew it was intended for me, giving epistemological arguments for the existence of God. I've never forgotten that. And it sort of shook my faith in absolute rationalism and atheism. In fact, it didn't last very long. But equally, what's nice to know is that Cyril Debrulé, having cut his teeth on me and so on, went on to become one of the leading Catholic theologians in India. There's a Pune seminary where the Catholics study theology, which is the leading seminary in India. There are smaller seminaries everywhere. But he is now, I would imagine, almost 70 plus. And he has been sort of a giant amongst the Jesuit theologians. So I feel privileged that I was the object of his lecture when he was 25 or 24 or whatever he was.
Do you recall what was your argument and what was his?
Oh, it's 50 years ago. I was 49 years ago. I mean, basically, it's this whole rational thing, that this is all supposition. The classic stuff you read as a kid,
Sure.
A bit of Nietzsche, a bit of I had, to some degree, I ended up in the position where Pascal does, where Pascal Vajer essentially argues that, between the option of believing and not believing God, you're better off believing. Because if you believe, and God does exist and you find out when you're dead, you've lost nothing.
Right.
If you don't believe, you're going to feel like a right idiot. So you may as well believe it costs less, That's the sort of argument. So in the end, I came around to that, though I think my faith has, I'm increasingly convinced that the world has more mysteries than science and rationality have answers to. And there's too much I have read, well-sourced and well-argued, well-footnoted, to accept the notion that everything can be rationally explained. There are paranormal phenomena, and there are too many things we dismiss as coincidence that could also have been the work of a higher intelligence or a higher So I've suspended my skepticism, and I think it's a part of a normal evolution that I'm sure others have gone through, and that's important. But anyway, what else can I talk to you about from
So
school?
then you didn't have these prayers or at home, Deepam and all that?
Yeah, I did. So my father and mother were very, very devout. So we had a prayer room in every home we lived in. And my father and mother, their idea of a good holiday was taking their kids off on a pilgrimage, which obviously was not our idea, because it was between the pilgrimage and going to their ancestral homes. That's all they wanted to do. And though I now remember those moments with a great deal of nostalgia and affection, at the time as children growing up in modern Bombay or later Calcutta, we would sort of much rather have had a different kind of holiday than spending time. But my roots in Kerala come entirely from spending a couple of months every year in a village, because both my father and mother came from villages. They're both born in villages, and staying in the Tharoor house, surrounded by people who didn't speak anything but Malayalam, discovering that my very limited cricketing skills, was dwarfed, stunted by my asthma, were good enough to hammer any Malayali players in those days, but no one played cricket very much. All of these things was all part of growing up, and my discovery of caste. If you read my book, India from Midnight to the Millennium, I have in it a thinly fictionalized account of what I really saw growing up, which is the first time I started becoming aware of all of this. Was this, and I still remember vividly, we were a Nair family, playing in the Tharwad, and there was a kid, a sort of with a toothy grin, sitting on the wall watching us. And I always asked my uncles and so on, why don't we invite him to play? And they said, you don't understand anything, that kind of thing. He was an Ujjava boy. And at one point I remember the ball, I think we were playing football in those days, not cricket. Ball was kicked and he caught it and returned it to us. And they shouted at him for doing so. They would rather have gone over the wall and picked up the ball because he had contaminated it. On one occasion when we kicked the ball into the well, for example, and he offered to help, and they told him rudely no, this kind of thing. And all this goes on. So then a few years later, this kid is playing with us. So society is already evolving, but he's not invited into the house. Then, next stage, he's invited into the house, but he's not invited to eat with us or in the kitchen. And I've seen all this with my own eyes growing up. Next year or next 2 years, he's now not only coming, he's being given food, but he doesn't sit at the table with us, he's given a plantain leaf on the floor and he's eating them. And then a few years later, the same kid is walking in and out of the house with complete freedom, going into the kitchen, talking familiar terms to others. And I took that story as a metaphor for Kerala's social evolution. How the progressive movements and awareness managed to rid people of all their prejudices against other castes and so on. So that story, in the book I made him into a Dalit because no one would understand why he was discriminated against, but as Vivekananda said, Kerala was a madhouse, and even a caste that is called an OBC caste was treated the way in which Dalits are treated in the north. So in the book, because it was a fictionalized account, I made it Dalit. And in the book, I merged another story. In other words, I had that character to all of this happens, taking the IS exams, becoming the collector, and in fact, being in a position to help this family when they have a problem with the land reform thing. So I hope you will read this. It's a story I'm very proud of, and it's been anthologized in other collections. I think Anita Nair did a collection called Monsoon Rains or something, of stories about Kerala, the best stories about Kerala. It's there. I just got a letter from somebody else saying it's being included in another anthology of village stories, whatever. So I'm quite proud of the fact that this story has had an impact. And I still remember one of my stories set in the same Tharwad house, the death of a schoolmaster. M.T. Vasudevan Nair, who knew my parents, came up to me and said, this is amazing, I'll consider making a film out of it. He never did, but I was very flattered by that. And then I still remember, I was so proud of the story, especially after M.T. Chetan's response and so on. And then I went to an evening in Calcutta, where a Malayali doctor said to me, what's the point of writing a story like this? It's just the story of your own upbringing. And it wasn't. I had imagined myself as a village character. So I realized that here was this Malayali, for whom my descriptions were so authentic that he thought it really had happened to me and I really had grown up in a village in Kerala, which of course I hadn't. So that was again what vindicated my sense of myself as a writer. Writers were always looking for affirmation, and these were the kinds of things that gave me affirmation. which is the advantage. That story was published in the Illustrated Weekly, which everyone read in those days. And that was something which is precious to me. Now I've digressed all over the place, but we're now back at the Fletcher School. So I wanted to join the UN because I was very interested in international affairs, but my initial ambition was to take the Foreign Service examinations. Because if you're very good at taking exams, and the best careers in the country are supposed to be in the government service, then you know that this is your ticket to a secure future, and every middle class parent says, okay, if everything else fails, do this, you know. You can't be a doctor, you can't be an engineer, you can't be a rich MBA. At least be an IAS officer or an IFS officer. I was more attracted by international affairs than by domestic affairs. In any case, in those days, the IFS was the more prestigious service because, as you all know, as you probably don't know, you're both too young, all three of you are too young. In those days, going abroad was a big thing because there was no foreign exchange. You got this $8 if you went. The cost of the ticket is probably more than your year's salary if you're I mean, my father was working in a successful private sector company. But thanks to the tax laws, pretty much everything he got was in the form of perks. He was given a free flat, a free car, free petrol, free electricity, free driver, free servant. But his salary was a joke. I mean, he was earning at the peak of his career in the late 70s. He got 5,000 rupees. But when I was going off to study abroad, I think his salary was 3,600, on which he had to pay tax also. So there was no question of luxuries. There was no question of him being able to support you in America, and so out of the question. You just had to fend for yourself. And that's something that again people forget because the world has changed so much. India has changed so much post-liberalization particularly. But anyway, I would have taken the exams, and I can immodestly say that I would have aced them because I aced every exam in those days. Today it's probably a different story. But you just master the art. You know how to study, you got the habit of studying, and I was very good. I mean, in St. Stephen's College, for example, I would put a padlock on my door so friends couldn't come and bother me, and switch off the light and open the back door. And then I would go to bed by 8:30 in the morning, wake up at 4, open the back door, and do all my studies. No one could disturb me. Otherwise, if you're like all the other students studying till midnight or 1 a.m., people landing up and saying, come on, let's go to the dhaba, or let's have a drink, or let's have a cup of chai, or whatever. And human nature being what it is, one would have been distracted. So I was also disciplined. But I still, a lot of people would have thought, you know, where has Shashi gone out at this hour of the night with the padlock on his door? Shashi was quietly sleeping and then waking up at 4 o'clock when nobody was around. That was Shashi's technique. But anyway, so I was very confident about the exams, but the emergency intervened. I've written about this also in India from Midnight to the Millennium. It was very much the period of my political maturation. Because I got my scholarship to go to Fletcher exactly that time. Like every Indian who goes abroad, in those days it was quite rare to go abroad, there weren't that many of us. But when I went, I almost felt obliged to speak for my country, sort of be an unpaid envoy of my country's interests and so on. And so initially I was defending the emergency. But the more I saw, the more I read, the more disillusioned I became. My roommate at Fletcher in the first year of campus accommodation was a journalist. In other words, Fletcher, most people were mid-career. It was a rare case of somebody coming straight from university, and that too younger than all my university contemporaries. Most people had done at least a couple of years of work. That's what Fletcher preferred. And this guy had worked as a journalist for a couple of years and was continuing to work part-time while doing his master's. And he used to bring back, in those days we had all these telex stories, PTI, AFP, Reuters, all of that. Much more than was appearing in the newspapers. Because the newspapers in America had limited interest in India. There'd be one story every 2 or 3 days, maybe a short item of something major happened. But this guy was bringing me reams, 15, 20 pages, Charlie Bennett. And we're still in touch, but now it's been, we don't see each other obviously as close as all that. But Charlie was my very close friend during that Fletcher period, and subsequently was one of the few Americans who came all the way from my marriage to the children of my mother. But Charlie gave me all of this stuff, and I read all this stuff, and I was getting more and more horrified and alienated. So the last straw was when, sometime in '76, there was a young, bright Indian student who spoke out against, censorship, arrests of politicians, and so on, saying this is not what Indian democracy should be all about. And the Indian embassy refused to renew his visa. Renew his passport. His passport expired. He went to get a new passport, and they refused to renew it. And I thought, how can I possibly seek to work for a government that can do others to its own people. So that's how close I came to sort of, turning my back on what was going on. But it's true, I never went back and campaigned for the 77 elections or anything like that. I was busy doing my own studies. In fact, during the election, January to March of 77, I was finishing my MALD degree and writing my thesis and all of that, so there's no time. And preparing those orals and everything else. So I never actually did ever myself contribute meaningfully to fighting for democracy in India, which I think is part of the guilty motivation all these years later that you must come back and do something in the country. But anyway, so I didn't do the examinations. The first year I was eligible was 77. I could have applied by January. I decided not to. And instead, I stayed on for a PhD. Otherwise, I had never joined Fletcher with an intention of doing a PhD, but everything had gone swimmingly, so I thought, why not do that too? And that's why I did the PhD in the third year. And then I had met, in very interesting circumstances, a senior Indian at the UN, a man called Virendra Dayal. He had been an IAS officer. He had been seconded to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees many years earlier during the 71 refugee crisis, the Bangladeshi crisis. And then they had liked his work and they'd kept him on. So now he was a senior official there. And he was visiting Calcutta on holiday with his wife and visiting the gentleman and reading the newspaper in the morning, summer of 75. He said, this is a very interesting article. Showed it to the host. And the host said, would you like to meet the author? And Viru Dayal said, yes, I wouldn't mind. And the guy said, good, because he's coming home tomorrow for a caste party. We're acting in the same play together. Because after graduating from college and before going to Fletcher, I had done the Mousetrap for the theatre group in Calcutta, a very well-known theatre group called the Red Curtain, amateur theatre, but which had adults and serious people in it. And the gentleman who was hosting Virendra Dayal was one of the actors in the play. I was the hero who turns out to be the villain. So it was a great part, and I relished it thoroughly. Detective Sergeant Trotter, I still remember, was in Agatha Christie's play, The Mousetrap. Anyway, so this guy showed the thing to Virendra Dayal and said, he's coming home for a caste party, why don't you meet him? So I'm always grateful for these accidents in life. That's why I'm not quite sure nothing is totally unplanned. Virendra Dayal comes to the party, or rather he's staying at the house, so he comes out of his bedroom or returns to his bedroom and comes out and joins the party. He takes me aside and chats to me for about half an hour. Then he said, you're a very interesting young man. When you come to New York, look me up. And fortunately, perhaps thanks to my father's training, because he was in advertising, so he knew the importance of public relations, I actually decided to look him up when I went. I didn't go to New York that often. As I said, I had no money, disposable income. But there was some opportunity. Some guys were sharing a car and going, so it cost me next to nothing to pay for the petrol, or my share of the petrol. So I went to New York, and I looked him up. And he, still remember him taking me to the delegates lounge at the UN, buying me a Bloody Mary, which couldn't afford alcohol in my
This is what year you're talking about? Which year you're talking about?
This will be 76, 7. He was also very critical of the emergency, despite being a senior government official. He was very disappointed what was happening in Indian democracy. I had conversations with him, went home for dinner once or twice, met him and his wife. And as I was coming to this decision of what to do with my life, when I was writing the PhD, he said to me, have you thought of applying to the UN? So I said, actually I have, but when I checked at the UN, India is overrepresented. They're not entertaining applications from Indian nationals. He said, yes, but UNHCR, the High Commissioner of Refugees, has no national quotas. In fact, there are very few Indians there. Why don't you apply? And he was a man of great ethics and correctness. So he did not participate in the process, because since I've opened the door to him, others have to do it. So when they saw my credentials, my academic record, the articles I'd written and all of that, they said, this guy has something. So they had me interviewed by the office in New York, which at that point Virendra Dayal was heading, but he did not participate in the interview. His senior officers did, and they wrote a very favorable report. Years later, I found in the personnel files of UNHCR. And then they invited me to Geneva for an interview. And by the time I'd gone there, they'd spent enough money on me, they had to hire me. So I defended my thesis on the last Friday in April 78, and I began my job at UNHCR on the 1st of May. I still joke that I have never had a holiday since my student days, really, because I was always a working